Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 12th. And as you know, paper number one will soon be due after the spring break. Next week is spring break. And I had extended the deadline a little bit because we've fallen behind. So, paper number one being the 26th of March, please send that via PDF to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. Of course, you can always hand in that paper early, and perhaps you might want to write about Much Ado About Nothing, which happens to be the play that we're on right now. And as you know, I had you watch a Hollywood production just so that you can contrast that to a production that was done in the reconstructed Globe Theater. That would have been A Midsummer Night's Dream. So you can see that a Hollywood production is very different, and they're able to take advantage of the fact that they aren't limited to a stage. So you have these beautiful outdoor scenes in Messina. And that said, the setting is perfect for a comedy, which is supposed to be filled with lush greenery and abundance. And notice how one of the opening scenes of the movie is about feasting. And we'll see feasting in a negative light when we talk about the tragedies, but right now the idea of appetite is viewed as something that's positive. And using things like A-list actors certainly doesn't hurt with a Hollywood production. Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson, the stars who play Benedict and Beatrice, and notice that they realize that that truly is the starring couple, not Hero and Claudio, even though Hero and Claudio are supposed to propel the action. Benedict and Beatrice, both those two stars, were married at the time of the production. I think you can tell that they definitely have a chemistry. Unfortunately, they are no longer married with one another and had a rather bitter divorce. But that's another story for another day. We know that the course of true love never did run smooth, and perhaps their love wasn't necessarily true, but Beatrice and Benedict's is, and that's what's important in terms of Much Ado About Nothing. So you can see in the notes below, I've indicated some of the points that you want to consider. And also, I had included the major points of the play in the notes where I had you watch the production of Much Ado About Nothing. I love the fact that Denzel Washington is not cast as the villain. That would have been very easy to cast the black actor as evil, and luckily Kenneth Branagh didn't fall for that temptation. Keanu Reeves is cast as our villain. Don't know if that's necessarily the best casting, but it certainly would bring in audience members, especially younger audience members, when we think about the time in which this film was released in the 1990s. So Keanu is just beginning to ascend in terms of his career. And if you look at the notes below, you can see that very typically with a Shakespearean drama, what we've got is that pyramid structure where at the bottom end of the left hand side would be Act 1, and this is where we're introduced to the characters, the setting, and the conflict. Note that the play begins with the men returning from war. So that's important on two fronts. The first being is that now that war is over, they're now ready for romance. And secondly, romance is another kind of war, a different kind of war, but another kind of war. And there's reference to the idea of a battle of wits between Benedict and Beatrice. And they're using language much like they would, or they might use weapons in a literal combat. So the men return from war, and again, we've got Shakespeare setting his play in an exotic locale, Italy, but outside of placing it in that, it may as well be in London. Hero and Claudio are presented as a younger, more immature love. They are a possible couple. Note that one of the things that Claudio says is that now that he's returned from war, it's a good time for him to think about romance. So some might think of this as a very kind of superficial relationship, though we had talked about with the Midsummer Night's Dream that arranged marriages and also marriages of convenience were not uncommon during the time of the Renaissance. Benedict and Beatrice are a very different kind of couple. They are older, they have not yet married, so they're wiser, and there are hints that are peppered throughout the play that they once had a romance that didn't work out. So one of the things that we know in watching a comedy is that we will get a happy ending. So at the ending, we will get a union with Benedict and Beatrice and Hero and Claudio, but more on that in a moment. We're introduced to Hero's father, Leonato. We know the importance of a father figure when we talked about Aegeus in A Midsummer Night's Dream, that the father basically thinks of the daughter as property and is able to dispose of her as he wishes. This will be important for the wedding scene, which happens in the play where Hero is rejected by her father. And also Antonio, which is Leonardo's brother, and he's going to be necessary in terms of forwarding the plot. As you know, the idea that Antonio is supposedly the father of a carbon copy of Hero. This idea of doubling is very common in Shakespeare, and while we believe, or at least the characters believe, that Hero is dead, and in some ways she is, her reputation has been killed, but they think that she's physically dead as well. Of course, what Claudio consents to is that he's going to marry Hero's carbon copy, which is what Hero's father's will is. Note that Claudio doesn't decide to do that until after it's been proven that Hero is innocent of infidelity. We see the importance of maintaining virginity, especially for female, especially in this play, which in many ways anticipates Othello. So keep this play tucked away in the back of your mind, because we're going to see a very similar kind of plot, albeit with the negative ending with Othello. And we're also introduced to Dogberry, who is an incompetent constable. We know that Shakespeare likes to give us characters who provide a certain level of comedy. We saw that with Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream. The importance of reputation cannot be overstated in A Midsummer, or in A Much Ado About Nothing. So the idea that Dogberry is so concerned with his reputation of being competent, and of course he's the exact opposite, mirrors the idea of reputation, because Hero's reputation is basically soiled. And also Benedict and Beatrice have their own reputations of being independent and not needing love. But methinks they doth protest too much. They remind me of a junior high school couple who maintain that they're not interested in one another, but as they tease and mock one another, it's pretty clear to everybody around them that they are romantically interested in one another. So, if we were to think about that pyramid structure again, we've got Act 2 with rising action. This is where Don John briefly tricks Claudio about Hero's wooing. There's just some foreshadowing here about how Claudio is going to be tricked again later on in the play by none other than Don John, who is a literal and figurative bastard, hence his title, Don John the Bastard. And one would assume that because he's a bastard, he is perhaps treated badly because he doesn't have direct lineage in the family. But there is no evidence that Don Pedro treats him badly. It seems that Don Pedro treats him as an equal. So the idea of being a bastard is less about being born out of wedlock and more about personality. Even Don John admits that he just enjoys creating havoc purely for the sake of creating havoc. And of course, Claudio is led to believe that Don Pedro is wooing for himself. And this might remind you of a kind of Cyrano de Bergerac setup, where Don Pedro is wooing in Claudio's name. Don Pedro being older and also being more established. So the idea is that he might be more successful than Claudio in wooing Hero. And Don Pedro also tries to woo Beatrice, and she lets him down easy, so to speak, in the sense that she tells him that, he would be too expensive to wear every day as a suit, and which is a nice way of her saying that she really isn't interested in romance, and we know the reason why is because her heart belongs to Benedict, even though she denies it. And ultimately, what we see in Act Two is how quickly Benedict is convinced to love Beatrice, even though he maintains that he doesn't need love. Some of the best lines in the play are about that. There's great wit between them. Notice this is a play of prose as opposed to having, or complete sentences, as opposed to having poetry. This is a play that's very much set in the world of reality as opposed to the world of fantasy, which is what we found in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And one of my favorite parts of the film version that I had us watch for class is how something as simple as a prop, a chair for instance, can become hilarious when Benedict is eavesdropping over the conversation that the men are having and their attempt to trick Benedict into loving Beatrice by saying that Beatrice loves Benedict first. And of course, that's all it takes for Benedict to decide that he loves her back. And his rationale is hilarious. The world must be peopled. In other words, he has a social and a moral responsibility to make little Benedicts and Beatrices. Of course, that's just a rationalization for what he wants to do anyway, which is to be with Beatrice. And that idea of eavesdropping is a major element in the play, just like facades. There's no mistake or coincidence that we're introduced to a costume ball at the very beginning of the play, that we all wear masks, whether literal masks, as you would in a costume ball, or a figurative mask where we're hiding our true selves, which, of course, gets to the idea of reputation and why Dogberry wants to appear more competent than what he is, and Benedict and Beatrice want to appear like they're independent individuals who aren't interested in one another, but we know that's the exact opposite. And of course, when we get to Act 3, which in the pyramid structure will be the height of conflict since Act 2 was rising action, Beatrice is convinced to love Benedict just as easily, again through eavesdropping. I personally believe that Kenneth Branagh, the actor who plays Benedict, who also is the director for the film version that we saw, is a little heavy handed when they're both celebrating their love. And Benedict is running through a fountain and Beatrice is on a swing. But it's not so easy to direct as well as star in a film, so perhaps it can be excused for that. We know that because Act 3 is going to be the height of conflict, it's not too surprising that this is where Don John rears his ugly head again. And he tricks Claudio about Hero's virginity. It's all a setup, in that Claudio believes he sees Hero with another man. It's really on somebody else, not Hero. But we know that Claudio is very insecure, and we know that he's easily swayed, and in the end, he's more likely to listen to a compatriot, a brother in war, if you will, rather than to Hero. Their romance is rather new, and they really don't know one another when you think about it. It's based on superficial appearances. Again, not necessarily unusual for the time of the Renaissance. So this is where Don John tricks Claudio, and then in Act 4, we get the beginning of descent. This is where Claudio rejects unfaithful Hero at the wedding in the most humiliating and public way possible. And this is where Hero's own father, Leonardo, wishes that Hero were dead because her reputation has already died. Note that all of the men basically are quick to judge Hero except for the friar, who is supposed to represent reason and rationality. He's the one who devises the scheme for Hero's seeming death, that we tend to value that which we no longer have. How's that for an understanding of the human condition? Therefore, if Hero is thought to be dead, she would be more highly valued, which is exactly what happens. But the other one who stands, the other male um, who stands by Hero is Benedict, and as much as Benedict has flaws and faults, he's filled with arrogance and pomposity. He also is, in many respects, a much more decent man than Claudio could ever be. And Beatrice, in one of her great speeches, there's so many great speeches in this play, talks about, oh, if only I were a man, that she could kill Claudio, stating that because she's not a man, she doesn't have the ability or the latitude or the strength in order to engage in murder. So she's trying to convince Benedict to do so, and at first he says it's in, and then he says he will, which I think is great proof of the upper hand that Beatrice has. And it is true that obviously female doesn't have as much voice or power as male during this time period. But look at what's just happened in this particular scene. Basically, she's convinced somebody else to do the dirty deed for her. And has kept her hands clean. Please keep this in mind when we read Macbeth and we start talking about Lady Macbeth. So you're beginning to see some parallels here. And we know that death can happen. And we also know that murder can happen because this is a comedy, which means that we're getting to a resolution in Act 5. This is where Benedict threatens Claudio, but of course we know that ultimately everything will be set right. It's Dogberry, of all people, who exposes Hero's innocence. Very interesting that Shakespeare oftentimes gives his lower level characters great power in his plays. They oftentimes are the ones who contribute to resolution or have beautiful poetry. And despite Dogberry's flaws, he's able to, or even in spite of Dogberry's flaws, he's able to reveal the horrible plot that Don John has been involved in to destroy Hero's honor. And again, we can think about reason and rationality. Why? Probably the best reason I can give is because he enjoys creating havoc. I mean, it could be a certain level of jealousy because we don't hear anything about him involved with a romantic relationship, but there really isn't any justification. Again, think about this when we get to Othello, which is really a retelling of Much Ado About Nothing. When we begin to talk about some of the motivations for what's been called Shakespeare's most consummate villain, and that happens to be Iago. So we get a resolution where Leonato will accept Claudio's apology if Claudio marries Leonato's niece. This is quite telling because Claudio at this point has discovered that Hero was innocent after all. And one must wonder if Claudio had made that resolution, would he have accepted Leonato's offer? And would he have made an apology to Leonato? Leonato's niece is revealed to be none other than Hero herself. And then Claudio and Hero reunite. And I know that this is an uncomfortable resolution for contemporary audiences, that she could so easily forgive all of the trauma that Claudio has inflicted upon her. But at the time of the Renaissance, this would be seen as a happy resolution. And Benedict and Beatrice, because they really are the stars of the play. We're supposed to care about Hero and Claudio, but the reality is Benedict and Beatrice have the best lines in the play. So Kenneth Branagh was very clever when he cast himself in the lead and cast his wife in the lead, rather than casting himself as in the couple of Hero and Claudio. Though, of course, Hero and Claudio are supposed to be younger. So from an age perspective, perhaps that wouldn't have made sense either, since Hero and Claudio is supposed to represent a more innocent and naive kind of love, a more superficial kind of love. And when after Hero and Claudio reunite, of course, the main issue is what's going to happen with Benedict and Beatrice. Notice how they vacillate back and forth. They are able to admit their love to one another, initially because they think the other has admitted their love first. It's very difficult for them to be sincere with one another, and they continue to bicker. That's one of the ways that they show their affection for one another, is that they are equally matched in their wits. There is a intellectual attraction between them in a way that we don't see with Hero and Claudio, which seems to be more physical. In fact, Claudio even asks Benedict at one point, what do you think of Hero and her appearance? And one of my favorite lines when Claudio asks, can you buy such a jewel? And Benedict's response is, yeah, on the box it came in too. So that said, what we want and what we get is Benedict and Beatrice together. They're forced to publicly admit their love to one another. It turns out that there are notes, love notes, that have been written that they are shown, and that's physical evidence that they do indeed love one another. And there's lots of commentary about what love does to an individual. We see Benedict basically becoming very foppish, very concerned with his appearance. When he's trying to write a love note, he talks about how he's lost his wit. He can't think of any interesting rhymes, just rather cliche rhymes. And again, the idea that when one is in love, one is clouded in their judgment and is concerned with superficialities, and also loses interest in that which they once were interested in. So Claudio was a warrior, but now he's basically become a lovesick boy. And Don John is going to be not only revealed as the villain, but will be punished later. That's also important for a comedy at the ending of the play, because we want to end the play on a positive note. Again, comedies were usually performed for celebrations such as weddings, or immediately before, immediately after a wedding. So the punishment, the negative part, is kept for later. So, a few observations about the play. We do know that after all of these mix ups and misunderstandings and difficulties with love, we will get a happy ending, or what's considered to be a happy ending. Again, contemporary audiences might not find it so happy that Hero is so easily able to forgive and forget, but that would have been considered a happy resolution during the Renaissance. And unlike Midsummer, it's very much set in reality. And part of that is that it's written in prose rather than poetry, which is seen to be much more lofty. We know that Hero and Claudio represent one kind of love, the young and superficial love, a love of convenience, while Benedict and Beatrice represent another kind of love, more mature love, but they're afraid to be vulnerable. That said, they're more interesting than Hero and Claudio. I had a professor in college who said that basically Benedict and Beatrice are essentially two lonely people. Don John admits that he's a plain dealing villain, a literal and figurative bastard. Friar, as I had indicated, represents reason and rationality, and it's only the friar and Benedict who are willing to stand by Hero's side. The importance of virginity for female. This play never would have unfolded this way if it turns out that Claudio had been unfaithful. And the importance of not only maintaining reputation, but the damaging nature of rumors and hearsay, one of the major themes in the drama. Dogberry, even though he is incompetent, will save the day, and he's so concerned with his own reputation, as are Beatrice and Benedict, one of the reasons why they're afraid to admit their love for one another. And in some ways, Benedict and Beatrice are the polar opposites of Claudio and Hero, just like Don John and Don Pedro are polar opposites of one another. Again, note the idea of doubles and opposites that we oftentimes see in Shakespeare, especially in this particular play. And as I had indicated, that costume ball, which I think shows that Beatrice has the upper hand, because it would seem that she knows that Benedict is behind that mask. Benedict doesn't necessarily know that she knows that. So he's quite hurt by some of the things she says, and she says these things deliberately because she knows she's saying them to Benedict. So I would always argue that it seems that Beatrice is the stronger of the two, in that she is able to not only convince Benedict to murder for her, but at the costume ball, she is able to manipulate Benedict. Now, below this, and I'm looking at the time as well, so we might not necessarily get to all of this, are important quotes and themes where I've asked at the ending of the quotes, this is in section 7 of the notes below, why? So, for instance, in the first act, Benedict is a ladies' man and loves none. Why? Beatrice doesn't want love. Why? Benedict lives as a bachelor. Why? Don Pedro thinks Benedict will change. Why? Claudio wants Hero. Why? Don Pedro to disguise himself as Claudio to woo Hero. Why? And I've argued that this play is all about disguises, facades, untruths, and misunderstandings. For Act 2, Beatrice will have no husband. Why? Benedict won't marry Beatrice. Why? Borachio and Don John want to stain Hero's honor. And borracho means drunk, by the way, in Spanish. Benedict wants all graces in a woman. Why? Leonardo finds B&B written on a paper, Benedict and Beatrice. Again, it reminds me of a junior high school coupling. Why? And Benedict is easily convinced to love Beatrice. Why? And Act 2 and the importance of maintaining reputation. And then in Act 3, Beatrice is easily convinced to love Benedict. Why? Claudio easily believes Hero's infidelity. Why? Dogberry incompetently believes a watch should offend no one. Why? Margaret uses quite a bit of body language here when the girls are alone, so to speak. So the women are by themselves and are able to talk about matters when they don't have to answer to any kind of male authority figure. There's a lot of sexual punning, and we know that Shakespeare is fond of sexual punning. This is the height of conflict in Act 3, but it'll spill into Act 4 because this is where Claudio publicly rejects Hero. Why? Don Pedro, Don John, and Claudio abandon Hero. Why? Leonardo, her own father, rejects her. Why? And then the friar makes a plan to fake Hero's death because we value we value what we no longer have. This is our lesson as audience. And then finally, the fifth act, where we see Beatrice's wit and also Claudio forgives Hero with my question of why. Benedict's very basic love rhymes as he tries to write poetry with why. Wonder seems familiar at this point. Why? And then finally, Beatrice and Benedict are together. Why? We see how their war of words has turned into a war of wit and finally of love. So I've indicated where those quotes appear. Those might be representative of some of your favorite quotes, but perhaps not. And that is today's attendance question, which will be due Friday on the 13th, or the 14th, I should say. And the question is, what is one of your favorite quotes in Much Ado About Nothing, and why? So that said, I look forward to reading your responses. I would have caught up with all of your discussion forum responses at this point. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you're certainly encouraged to respond to your peers. But you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. Now, next week, we will not be meeting because it is spring break, and this would be a good time for you to not only work on your paper, but also to read the next play. We are moving from the comedies to a history play, Richard II. So you can see this in the last section in the notes below. I've given you a link from the Full Shakespeare Library where you can find Richard II, but you can find Richard II in a lot of different places. So what we're going to be doing next class is putting closure onto Much Ado About Nothing, and also introducing the idea of a history play. Now that's a different kind of genre. And why we're reading Richard II as our representative history play. And of course, we'll talk about performance. I wanted to give you a very different kind of performance. You might have heard of the BBC, and they are known for very well done performances in England. And they had quite the project in the 1980s, even though it's a bit dated, to put all of Shakespeare's plays on film and to be as accurate as possible to his language. So the BBC versions are usually the closest you're going to get to what Shakespeare himself wrote. So the history plays are notoriously confusing. We'll talk about some of the reasons why, and that's why I wanted you to be able to see a BBC production, because you can literally read along with the play itself if you wanted to and basically get the play. So again, your attendance question, if you need an extension, let me know. But Friday the 14th is our date, because that would be the last day before we begin our spring break. So next week I will post on Moodle just to remind you that we're on spring break. But this is time for you to work on your paper and begin Richard II. But as we're putting some closure onto Much Ado About Nothing, what is one of your favorite quotes in Much Ado About Nothing, and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on a week from now. Have a nice spring break. Take care. Bye bye.